Today we take a look at one of the most fondly remembered publishers of the early 1990s, Valiant Comics. Now, I'd love to get into the whole star-crossed saga that was the original Valiant Comics, but there's so much to the story that would be an episode unto itself. Also, someone kind of already did a covering of Valiant Comics history. In a nutshell, Valiant Comics was founded by former Marvel editor-in-chief Jim Shooter, and they debuted with a series of licensed comics, most notably 3 licensed properties published by Gold Key Comics in the 1960s. Those properties being Dr. Solar, Man of the Atom, Magnus Robot Fighter, and Turok, Son of Stone. Now, what Shooter planned out was to have these 3 books weave together in a grand narrative for the entire Valiant universe, so the books would actually be used to launch new heroes and titles. Case in point, today's entry, Rye, was actually launched as a backup story in the Tales of the Magnus Robot Fighter comic. Now, for reference, Magnus took place in the 41st century. By this point, the nation of Japan had become completely covered in urban sprawl, and this was being controlled by a giant supercomputer known as Grandmother. Grandmother, in turn, was protected by Rye, a chosen champion whose mantle had been passed down from generation to generation. Now, in the Magnus comic, the title of Rai was inherited from Nakadai Rentaro by his son Nakadai Toru. And also, Grandmother used her last bit of energy to remove Japan from the planet Earth and encase it in 3 metal dragons, turning the place into a new moon. And with that, we're starting off on the new Rai ongoing series collected in Valiant Masters, Rai, Volume 1. Japan is being torn apart by the vestiges of Grandmother's government and a group of Neo-Luddites known as the Healers, who wish to return Japan to pre-Grandmother status. Caught in the middle of all of this is Rai, who has sworn to protect all of Japan, no matter what. The problem is, the government blames Rai for the loss of Grandmother, and the Healers see him as a tool of the establishment. Not helping any of this is the fact that Toru's estranged wife, Kazuyo, has been fighting on behalf of the government. Now, Rai's wife, Kazuyo, is in possession of a special living armor that once belonged to an invading alien force, and her inheritance of this took place during the Magnus Robot Fighter storyline. Rai does his best to quell the fighting. Afterwards, Kazuyo takes her husband to task for not fighting alongside her and the government. She also notices that the Healers made off with a part of Grandmother. Kazuyo takes the information on the missing part to her superiors. They conclude that the piece could be used in the manufacturing of a powerful weapon. Any idea of calling Rai for help is shot down. They can't really trust him yet. Meanwhile, Rai is at a childcare facility attempting to see his newborn son Takeshi. Kazuyo arrives and allows Rai to see his son, and once more tries to talk him into joining her side. Kazuyo then leaves to rejoin her forces in an attempt to gauge the Healers. Rai arrives just in time as the Healers spring their trap, a newly constructed body for Grandmother. Rai is conflicted as Grandmother tries to keep him from fighting her. However, she winds up crushing someone under her foot. Knowing that Grandmother would never harm one of her own people, Rai takes out a support beam and the imposter bot falls into a molten pit. The next day, workers at the facility begin hurling garbage at Rai because he's now extended their work hours. Also, news of the failing reaches Toru's father. Rai tries to take out his frustrations by taking down a drug ring. Unfortunately, this was not sanctioned by the government. They only want him to help with the Healer attacks. Rai points out that again, his duty is to protect all of Japan, and storms off. Meanwhile, the Healers prepare to stage another attack. Unfortunately, they inadvertently wander into the domain of a villain named Ice Spike. Okay, I'm calling this now. As far as supervillain names go, Ice Spike? That's pretty weak sauce. Meanwhile, Rai receives a visit from his father, Rentaro. Rentaro takes Toru to task for his recent actions. Toru has been acting way too wishy-washy. Before he can say anything more, reports of Ice Spike's attack come in, and Rai leaves. Rai arrives only to be suddenly swamped by addicts. It turns out that Ice Spike is behind the drug ring. Kazuyo and her superiors monitor the situation from afar until she leaves to save her husband. Back with Rai, he tries to fight through Ice Spike's drugs and his attacks. Eventually, Kazuyo arrives and begins fighting Ice Spike. The villain begins to gain the upper hand when Rai recovers and sends him through a plate glass window. Ice Spike then steals a vehicle and escapes. Afterwards, the general public began taking Rai to task for destroying the drug ring. It turns out they needed the drugs due to the rapid changes they've all been going through. They couldn't handle the stress. It's then that the healers begin another attack at a seawater storage facility. They activate another grandmother module and use it to gain control of the Neverweb. The Neverweb is a wormhole-esque dimension that Rai uses to travel throughout all of Japan in a quick and timely manner. Back with Rai and Kazuyo, he takes her to task for not visiting Takeshi. She explains that she has a duty to the government. Rai then leaves. It's then that news breaks out about the healer attack. Rai enters the Neverweb to stop the healers. Meanwhile, Kazuyo stops by the childcare center to visit Takashi, but leaves upon hearing word of the attack. She remote calls her armor and hops into a cab. Unfortunately, the cab is being driven by the leader of the healers. Now, the healers are led by a woman named Makiko, and not surprisingly, they have a man on the inside of the government in the form of a counselor named Seiko. I haven't touched much on these characters because, to be honest, they're repetitive, really cliched, and pretty dull. They tend to just be saying the same things over again, like, I will soon be ruling over Japan. We will return things to the way they used to be. We are on the right side. Rai begins traveling through the Neverweb, only to suddenly crash into an invisible barrier. Meanwhile, Kazuya and Makiko begin fighting in the flying cab. Back with Rai, he suddenly finds himself staring down a creature in the Neverweb. Rai struggles to fight the creature and he cuts a part of it off, only to have it begin to multiply. It's then that he realizes he's fighting the Neverweb himself. Back with Kazuyo and Makiko, the cab crashes into a museum and Kazuyo holds the revolutionary off long enough for her armor to arrive and Makiko then flees. Meanwhile, Rai realizes the only way to exit the Neverweb is to surrender to it. The creature swallows him and he slowly begins navigating his way out. Unfortunately, once he's arrived, it's too late. The healers have already left. A few days later, the government scientists manage to crack the healer's communication code. He informs a security guard who he believes to be a friend. It turns out the guard is actually a healer agent. Word of the code breaking gets to Makiko, who begins to implement the healer's big plan involving a large rocket. The plan is still found out, and Kazuyo is called in, and she leaves Rai with Takashi. Later, Toru and Rentaro talk. Rentaro chews his son out over his ineffectiveness. Toru says that he was ill-prepared for the responsibility of being Rai, and as they talk, Kazuyo and her forces implement their attack on the healers. The healers counter with a battle mech suit controlled by Makiko. The suit is impervious to Kazuyo's attacks. Rai has noticed the explosion and leaves to join the battle. He pieces together Rentaro's visit was a means to distract him. Rentaro begs forgiveness, but Rai refuses and leaves. Upon Rai's arrival, Makiko takes Kazuyo and activates the rocket. She begins trying to place Kazuyo into the exhaust burner. Rai struggles to take down the battle suit, so he tries one last effort, releasing all of his energy into the suit. It worked, but the rocket is knocked free from its moorings, and the rocket takes off. As Rai lunges to stop the rocket, he tries one last effort by throwing an energy spear at the rocket. The rocket explodes, ripping a hole in the outer hull of Japan. Men, women, and children are immediately ejected into the void of space. Days later, Rai decides to exile himself from the rest of Japan. Rai prepares to leave along with Takashi, Kazuyo deciding that her son would be better off on Earth with his father than in the hostile environment that Japan has become. The Japanese president stops by to wish Rai good luck. Rai takes Takashi on board a small ship and leaves. However, soon after takeoff, the ship drastically changes course and starts flying away from Earth and into the deep void of space. The ship has been sabotaged. Back on Japan, Kazuyo gets a call from the president. He tells her to meet with him and leave her armor behind. Haven't used this one in a while. Q Akbar. Kazuyo arrives at the president's home to find several other high-ranking officials also having been called there. It's then that Seiko opens the door and invites Kazuyo in. She's immediately jumped by a group of ninjas who chop off her hand. Kazuyo's right hand has a special ring on it that allows her to remotely control her armor. Seiko then reveals that the message from the president was really a computer simulation. The real president has been long dead. He then informs her about the sabotage done to Rai's ship. Kazuyo is thrown in prison with a surprising roommate, Makiko. Turns out the government isn't the only group Seiko betrayed. Back with Rai, he comes to the realization that sacrificing himself will give Takeshi more time to possibly be rescued. He prepares to commit seppuku But it's then that he realizes he might have one last shot by channeling his energy into the ship's engines. It works, and his ship begins rocketing back towards Earth. The ship crashes into Africa, and Rai emerges with Takashi. It's then that he's greeted by the Eternal Warrior MacLeod and Rocky of the Harbinger team. And here we run into a little bit of a problem. See, at this point, Rai begins to play a part in a larger Valiant crossover event called Unity. And only the Rai issues of Unity are collected here. Now, why is that a problem? Well, Unity itself, it's not likely to ever be collected. See, the people who now own the rights to the Valiant comic book characters don't own the rights to Magnus, Solar, and Turok. And to further complicate things, most of the reference material I tried to look up for Unity is pretty sparse. I basically could only find a Wikipedia entry that had a lot of two-sentence summaries in it. So I am going to try my darndest to explain what exactly is going on in the Unity crossover. Bear in mind, I'm going to be missing a lot. Erica Pierce was a physicist who worked alongside Dr. Phil Selesky. The two wound up being caught in a lab accident that resulted in both of them gaining matter manipulation powers. Selesky became Dr. Solar, a godlike being who began reworking the universe, and in effect creating many of the Valiant characters, while Pierce became Mother God, and sought to return the world to its natural state. To begin implementing her ultimate plan, Erica began constructing what she called the Unity Tower in a spot called the Lost Land, which was home of Turok. Solar was able to figure out Mother God's plan and slowly began assembling heroes throughout time in an attempt to stop her. These heroes included Magnus, Rai, Exo Man-O-War, Gilad the Eternal Warrior, Archer and Armstrong, and the kids from the Harbinger team. At this point, I now begin talking about issue number 6 of Rai, which is actually part 7 of the Unity crossover. Gilad and Rocky inform Rai that they have been well aware of the recent events in Japan, even the coup by Seiko. While they understand his desire for vengeance, he's needed for bigger concerns, namely taking down Mother God. Rai agrees to join the two, but he knows they'll need more help, namely Magnus. The trio set out and locate Magnus. After briefly taking out one of the robot fighter's enemies, Magnus reluctantly agrees to help them. The group then drops Takeshi off in an orphanage for safekeeping. Back on Japan, Kazuyo forms a reluctant alliance with Makiko and the two begin setting an escape plan. Back on Earth, Rai, Magnus, and the others prepare to enter the Lost Land and stage an offensive attack on Mother God. They find the entrance portal blocked and Rai smashes it with his energy channeling katana. They are immediately attacked by Mother God's forces as she watches from the Unity Tower. Mother God makes note of Rai's power, and she contacts the group to make Rai an offer. Join her, and Japan will be saved. She then reveals that Japan has actually slowly been slipping from its orbit, and is now heading towards Earth. As Rai debates, the portal begins to close. This means that if he leaves to save Japan, he can't return. Eventually, Rai turns down the offer, and the parts of Japan slip from orbit and begin crashing into the Earth. Rai then swears revenge on Mother God. And now we have to briefly delve back into the other parts of the Unity saga. Dr. Solar brings a team of heroes from 1992, the present of the Valiant universe, and they briefly form an alliance with Rai and the others, only to split up after an attack from Mother God. Solar takes the team from 1992 and mounts an attack on Mother God, but it's defeated after Mother God traps Solar in a wormhole. At this point, we now go into Rai issue number 7, which is part 15 of the Unity crossover. Meanwhile, Rai and Magnus try attacking the outer perimeter of Mother God's facility. It too proves futile. Rai then tries a solo attack, but he's quickly overwhelmed and needs to be bailed out by Gilad and Magnus. Rai has been so drained of his energy that he's been bedridden for the past 4 days. Magnus tries desperately to keep Rai from launching another solo attack, and eventually Rai agrees to stand down and plot a better course. Also, at this point, Magnus informs Rai that he had to kill someone named the Grand One. I don't know who the Grand One is. I think it may possibly be some form of grandmother, but I'm not entirely sure. Rai and Sting, another hero from the Harbinger squad, find a weak spot in Mother God's defenses, and this enables the rest of the team to infiltrate the facility. They get found out, though, and are immediately set upon by an army of robots. The group begins fighting the robots and while trying to work their way towards Mother God and the still captive Solar. Eventually, Rai decides to stay behind and try to hold off the robots, enabling the others to help free Solar. The group reaches the area where Solar's wormhole is being kept. They immediately set about trying to free him. Meanwhile, Mother God appears to fight Rai. Mother God manages to temporarily blind Rai with her first attack, but he is able to strike her with his sword. She then manages to knock Rai back and then blasts him away. As Rai lies dying at Mother God's feet, they both realize Solar has been freed. And at this point, we finally end our dealings with Unity. The storyline isn't technically done yet, but it did end not too long after this. However, we're not quite done with Rai, as issue 8 concerns the fallout from Japan crashing back into the planet Earth. Kazuyo emerges from the wreckage of Japan, and Makiko has also survived. The two set out to survey the wreckage. Kazuyo explains what happened to Rai, though she doesn't know anything about what happened in Unity, and how Seiko tricked them all. Makiko wishes Kazuyo good luck on her revenge, and leaves. Meanwhile, Seiko searches desperately for Kazuyo's severed hand and armor-controlling ring. It's then that Kazuyo arrives and begins taking out Seiko's guards. They start to overwhelm her when Makiko shows up with reinforcements. They burst into the presidential office just as Seiko begins to make his escape. He has the armor with him, but not the control ring. Makiko's people help Kazuyo locate her severed hand, and this enables her to activate her armor and destroy Seiko's ship in the process. Reunited with her armor, Kazuyo tracks down Seiko, only to discover he's formed an alliance with Ice Spike. She manages to take the supervillain down and finally blows Seiko's head off. It's then that Rentaro appears. He has someone with him. It's Rocky, who's carrying Takeshi. Rentaro explains that although Rai wasn't killed by Seiko, he did die trying to stop Mother God. Kazuyo and Makiko make peace, knowing that they must work together for the betterment of all Japan, and begin the healing. And that ends Valiant Masters Rai, Volume 1. The series would actually continue, this time with a new Rai named Konoshi Takao. As for Rai Volume 1, well, there are some parts of this I like. I do actually kind of like the first bit of this storyline, especially the idea of a struggling legacy hero who seems to screw up just as much as he succeeds. In fact, I think it's kind of indicative of James Robinson's Starman series that would come out not too long after this. And the artwork, for the most part, is actually pretty good. The printing isn't spectacular, but the artwork itself is actually pretty good. That being said, there are some major problems here, too. I already spoke about the villains, how they're really kind of cliched and overdone a little bit. And, yeah, the Unity tie-ins. They really bring this whole thing to a screeching halt. They either A, should not have been in this collection, or B, maybe there should have been some like bridging text pieces that could have filled in the gaps a little bit. It definitely would have made it easier for a review. And, you know, because of that big Unity tie-in stuff, I feel like I can't recommend this to a new reader. And that makes it really hard because, like I said, I did enjoy parts of this book, so I can't really say I hate it, but I can't recommend it to a new reader. It's a little too dense. And because of that, I'm going to have to give Valiant Masters Rai a D. And with that, let's see what we'll be doing next time on the Random Trade Review.